Let me start off with a question here. How many of you think about who's going to run the world for the next 100 years? Not the answer, just how many of you think about it? How many of you consider this? Who's going to be the global power? Who's going to be the driver? Who's going to make the decisions that we sort of all have to live by for the next century? It's a question that we, who belong to what Winston Churchill referred to as the English-speaking peoples of the world, have rarely had to think about, and certainly not for very long, over about the last 300 years, frankly. This is a map of the British Empire, certainly not at its height, but for a couple hundred years before the Second World War, the British Navy and industrial might essentially defended what were the communication highways of the time. Since the Second World War, the Americans have taken this on with a gusto, which is really, frankly, without historical precedent. This is a map of US bases across the world for those of you that think we don't have an empire. The real question now, though, is that for the first time in about 300 years, realistically, give or take a few blips, which we managed to overcome together and sometimes separately, who's going to run the world for the next 100 years? Will they care about democracy and rule of law and suffrage and equality and all the other things that we have evolved to caring about? I'm not pretending that the British did everything perfectly. They did an appalling job of running the world, but they probably did a better job of it than any of the options at the time. And the Americans, frankly, have done an appalling job of running the world, but again, a far better job than any of the options. Consider the Nazis or the Soviets or Pol Pot or anybody else that was out there. Okay, who can we expect to do this for us in the future? Well, I'm going to say to you that I don't think it's going to be he who has most of these, those are cruise missiles, or even he who has most of these, aircraft carriers, who will end up being the rulers of the world for the next century. These things will be important, certainly, but it won't be about destructive power. It's going to be about constructive power, I think. In fact, the next ruler of the globe will be whoever has abundant sources of power. And I'm not talking about military power, political power. I'm talking about the kind of power that we all need to run the information and technology industries, which are absolutely essential in this new world that we're all moving into. Think about your own daily lives. As you all sit here just now at your homes, there are little red lights, little orange lights, little green lights all blinking away. When you get home tonight, you're going to plug in innumerable devices so that they're all charged and ready for you to take on the world tomorrow. There's nothing that we do during the day or night time that doesn't rely entirely on energy, and mostly electrical energy nowadays. Really nothing that we do, except for one or two things which I'll leave the adults in the audience to figure out. And even some of those require electricity from time to time, so I'm told. The other thing that's, of course, terribly important to us human beings is water. I've put it second after energy, and you'll see why in a minute. But, of course, water is very important to everything that we do. We can't live without it. It's really very rare, actually, oddly enough. There's only about 1% of it that's usable to us on the planet, and I'll leave this to the next speaker, who's much more of an expert than I am on it. But the reason I've mentioned water here is because it is another essential staple. But I want to show you an equation here, which is kind of important. Energy equals water. Okay, that's an equation that I'd like you to take away from what I have to say, if nothing else. About 19% of the energy that we use in California goes to moving water around one way or another. But that's not the really interesting thing about it. The fact is, if you have abundant energy, you can have abundant water. Okay? It doesn't matter where you are in the world. Take this map of California, for example. We all know that California is hardly overflowing or brimming at the seams with water. In fact, it's a real problem for us. The whole bottom half of the state's a desert. It wouldn't be green at all if man hadn't pumped water from all sorts of other places with tremendous ecological and environmental impact, by the way. This is not a free ride by any means. But if you look at this map, what you're going to see is that actually there's a good deal of blue on the map of California. We don't have a water problem. We're sitting next to the largest body of water in the world. What we have is a salt problem, okay? There's loads and loads of water out there. We just can't do anything with it. Or rather, I should say we won't do anything with it. Not that we can't do anything with it, because energy equals water. This is a desalination plant. Probably not the best picture I could have chosen, because one of the points I'm about to make is why we don't do this, and you'll see why. They are better looking at than this nowadays, and they are smaller. But anyway, this is a plant where you can take vast amounts of salt water and turn it into fresh water. And without going into the details, because I don't have time, let me just tell you this. We could make enough fresh water from the Pacific Ocean to supply all of California's needs, no matter what the population does. And even, I might point out, become a net exporter of of water to our brethren in the states east of us who aren't lucky enough to live on the world's largest and most glorious ocean, the Pacific. We could do it. And there are two reasons we don't do it. The first one is permitting. Okay, you can never get something like this through permitting. Why? Because there's lots of NIMBYism around. We have a tendency, as long as there's water dribbling out of our taps, we're not going to do anything that will help ourselves or anything that we need to do, because we tend to wait until it's sort of too late to make those types of decisions, right? So nobody really wants to see something like this happening. And then the other reason that we don't do it is this. Notice that sort of almost quarter of the real estate here is devoted to getting energy into this plant. Okay, it's a very energy-intensive process getting useful water out of salt water. And energy is expensive, relatively speaking, and it's also very harmful the way we make it today. Okay, and so those are the two main reasons that we don't desalinate. But we could do it, and we will have to do it one day, by the way. There's no question in my mind about that. We human beings will rely on desalination at some point in our future. But I mentioned Winston Churchill earlier on. Let me just tell you one other thing that he used to say about Americans. And by the way, he was half American himself, so he had a right to say it. Winston Churchill used to say, Americans will always do the right thing, but not until they've exhausted every other possibility. And so this is how and when we will get to desalination. But this isn't Ted World and Desmond's opinions about global domination and all that sort of stuff, and it's not even Ted State, it's Ted City, and we're really supposed to be talking about San Diego. So I'm going to talk about San Diego a little bit. I'm going to talk about renewables in San Diego, and I'm going to give you a few examples of things that we could really easily do today that are right at our fingertips. And let's not prove Winston Churchill right. Let's not exhaust all the other possibilities. Let's take some of them on. Now, I put this picture up here because one of the things that's very important, although we all love this place and it's beautiful and we're blessed with a wonderful climate and all that sort of stuff, it's very important that this city remains a competitive place, right? It won't be interesting if people, the best and the brightest, don't want to come here, and if we can't retain the most interesting companies. This is not going to be an interesting place. There are lots of places which are geographically beautiful across the world, but they're not necessarily full of interesting people. So we've got to have the combination of it. We've got to stay competitive here. And I'm going to say, this is a familiar slide, you'll see it over and over again. Energy, nowadays, in this day and age, energy, the availability of abundant sources of reliable energy, is probably the most important factor in a city managing to maintain its competitive nature. Okay? It turns out that blackouts are not just annoying, they're not just inconvenient, they're dangerous, people die in them and all that sort of stuff, but they're also bloody expensive. The US spends up to $190 billion a year on business interruptions associated with loss of energy. Okay, that's a lot of money. Now, when we look at the way we spend money and the things that we spend money on, I'm going to say often during the following slides, we have the money to make the change. We have the technology to make the change. I'm not certain we have the will. Okay, and that's what it's going to come back to. But when you hear me saying that we have the money, it's not that I suggest that we have bucketloads of cash sitting in our bank accounts. It's just that we're already spending money. $190 billion a year, for example, on blackouts. So we're already spending that money, but to sort of prove Churchill's phrase, we're spending it after everything's gone wrong instead of spending it in advance to make sure that it doesn't go wrong anymore. So energy and the availability of it and it being reliable is very, very important to us. Energy equals jobs. Okay, reliable and abundant energy equals jobs. I apologize for the very confusing handshaking that's going on in that picture. I have no idea what. There must be lawyers who have just screwed somebody. So it's going to be an awful lot of energy that we're going to need, right? Remember what I said earlier? All of us rely on just using energy anyway. God, I can hardly see because of these lights blazing in my eyes right now. I'm baking up here because of the heat energy coming off them and everything like that. Why that's important and necessary, I don't know, but here it is. Burning energy as quickly as we can all over the place. The question is, where does it come from today, and what are we going to do about it in the future? So let's deal with where it comes from today. And to do that, I'm going to go back 300,000 or 400,000 years in our history. Okay, that's a long way. Human history hasn't been around much longer than that. So 300,000 or 400 years, 100,000 years, because no one's really sure exactly when it happened. But 300,000 or 400,000 years ago, the Bill Gates or Steve Jobs of his time came up with what was just the greatest technology shift that's probably ever happened to mankind. And he did that, he or she did that, when they figured out how to capture and control fire. Okay, caveman, and we were all related to people that looked like this, some of us more recently than others probably, but caveman figured out if you burn stuff, you can release heat and light energy, okay? And it changed everything, okay? So now let's fast forward 400,000 years today in San Diego. And what do we find? We're not doing anything any differently. We still burn stuff to release heat and light energy. And amusingly enough, we actually burn the very same stuff that caveman was burning, right? Sticks and bits of wood and leaves and all that kind of stuff. The only difference is that the stuff that we burn has been crushed and compressed underground for a very long time, but it's still plants and animals. That's what coal is, that's what oil is, that's what natural gas is, right? We're just burning stuff to release heat and light energy. And when you burn stuff, it creates a lot of smoke. That's one of the things that's not very good about it. You end up with this kind of view of San Diego. This is not Los Angeles, by the way. This is San Diego. Okay, we make a lot of smoke when we burn stuff. And the other thing about burning stuff is it's not really very sustainable. It turns out that burning stuff, as long as there are less than 3 billion of us on the planet, is something that can go on for a very long time. And up to 1966, there were only about 3 billion of us on the planet. And then I was born, and that all changed. And now we're at 7 billion, heading for 10 billion in the next couple of decades. Okay, so burning stuff just doesn't work anymore. It's not about whether or not there's a lot of stuff. It's because there are so many of us that we're all trying to burn the same stuff. People talk about peak oil all the time. Is that a term you've heard? Peak oil? Anybody heard the term peak oil? When's peak oil going to happen? What people mean by that is, when will it come a day when we get less oil out of the ground than we got yesterday out of the ground? That's what people mean by peak oil. That's a nonsense. Who cares about that? The only peak oil that matters is peak oil per capita. Okay? Peak oil per capita. Peak oil per capita happened in 1979. All right? Take that home with you as well. So it's over. It may be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever else, but it is definitely over. The burning stuff thing is over. And thank goodness for that, because although it was fine for cavemen, it's not been brilliant for us. Now, this is where it gets good, okay? We are, all of us, in the most fantastically exciting period of history since he or she in the cave figured out that if she burnt stuff, she could release heat and light energy. And why do I say that? Because for the first time in the history of humanity, we have the technology and even the money to have all the growth and have all the things and comfort and security and democracy and all the other things that we want. We can have all of those things without contributing to accelerated entropy. It's the first time in our history we don't have to destroy stuff to have growth, because we finally have technology whereby we can create energy and we can create things and we can recycle things and we can do it without wrecking stuff. And that is just a very, very exciting prospect. We are that generation. You know, we often hear people talk about the greatest generation, by which they're referring to the World War II generation, and in many ways they're right, but we could be that generation. Okay? We could go down in the history books as being the people who said, stop, enough is enough, we have the technology, we can do things differently, and we can save this planet, and actually we can make this a better place. To Molly's point, is the place going to be a better place for the next generation than it is for ours? It could be. Okay? A fantastically exciting proposition. We have the money, we have the technology. The only question, folks, is whether or not we have the will. Okay? So I'm going to give you 3 examples of things that we can do in San Diego easily. And I mean easily, right? We put a man on the moon. Remember when Kennedy said that in 1960 or 61 or whatever it was, we're going to put a man on the moon this decade? There were 100 people behind him saying, don't say that. We can't do it. It's impossible. You're going to get us all in trouble and all that sort of stuff. But he had the guts to say it anyway. And what did we do? July of 1969, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. Bravo. Bloody vo. Okay? Fantastic. Where is that today? Where is that guts and where is that leadership? That's what we need. So let's start with this thing here. This is a solar tree under which are parked 6 electric vehicles. Okay? The electrification of transportation is one of the greatest things that's going to happen in the next few years. We're going to live to witness it, thank God. I have been to the Hamtramck plant in Detroit where they build those things. I can tell you this is not EV1. It's not going to come to an end. This is for real this time. For goodness sakes, there's an electric Rolls Royce, $3.5 million, 3.5 tons. $1 million a ton. That's how I buy my cars. So this solar tree here is shading 6 to 8 parking spaces, and underneath it there are 6 electric vehicles, and serendipitously enough, it produces enough renewable energy every day to fully charge the batteries in those electric vehicles. Now think about that for a second. There are 800 million parking spaces in these United States of America. 800 million. It's a big number, okay? What was that, 3 or 4 for every man, woman, and child in the country? If we covered every single one of those with solar power generation, we could create enough renewable, clean energy, which we own. We don't have to fight to defend it. We don't have to make friends and shake hands with the devil and all that sort of stuff. We own it. It's ours. The sunlight that comes down on this country belongs to us. Okay, it doesn't have to be defended. We could make enough energy to power all of the US's transportation requirements, not once, not twice, but 3 times, folks. 3 times over if we did that. This is not environmental blight. We're not digging up deserts. We're not killing shrews or tortoises or anything else like that. We're just improving already wrecked real estate. What could be worse than a parking lot, right? We're architecturally improving it, but we're also changing the world. This is a very exciting proposition. So let's take a look at San Diego. Qualcomm Stadium. Anybody been there? Okay, 19,000 parking spaces more or less. That means we could generate enough energy there to power about 19 or 20,000 electric vehicles just by covering that horrible mess that's down there. Heat island effect and everything else. Really bad for the environment beyond the fact that we don't use it for anything than parking cars. The airport, another 10,000 electric vehicles could be energized just by covering the parking lot in the airport with solar. I mean, it's so obvious, right? It's such a fantastic thing to do. Are we doing it? No. No. Why? Because when we turn on the tap, there's water there, and because everything else seems to be working all right for us. And that's what Churchill was talking about. But for God's sakes, let's prove him wrong. Okay? Now, it's interesting when you do the big environments, but what happens when it starts getting ubiquitous? What happens when there's electric vehicle charging stations, solar-powered, solarly energized electric vehicle charging stations in every environment that you go to, big and small? What happens when wonderful companies like Car2Go, who had the guts to come here and put little electric car sharings around here and reduce the number of vehicles on the street? What happens when we give them the charging infrastructure that they so desperately need, so they don't have to keep flatbedding cars back to their buildings? San Diego could be the first city in the world to have ubiquitous electric vehicle charging stations. We could be the first city in the world to say, no oil, sick of it. Okay, we're not doing it anymore. Not going to do it anymore. We're going electric, okay, because we have the technology, we have the money. The question is, do we have the will? We could be the first country in the whole, city in the whole world to do that, and we could do it 100% renewably, okay, because electric vehicles are great, don't get me wrong, but when they're running down the street on coal-fired power or gas-fired power, which is 75% of the electricity that we generate in the United States, carbon-based, burning stuff just like the coal, like the cavemen, that's not that great. Solar-powered electric vehicles driving on sunshine. Believe me, folks, it feels wonderful. I've done it. Try it, okay? It's an incredible experience. It really is. So that's electrification of transportation. That's using renewables. That's using parking. It's so obvious, for goodness sakes. You know, why aren't we doing it? Could we really be that stupid as a race, as a species, to just ignore this obvious thing for us here? Let me show you another one, okay? One thing that we Americans are really good at is producing garbage. By God, we are tops where that's concerned. All right, about 3/4 a ton per person per year of garbage. In San Diego, we truck about 1 million tons of garbage up the road to Miramar every year. Now, Miramar is a very well-run place. And they do a great job of it, but at the end of the day, it's still 1 million tons of garbage going up there, okay? We don't need to do that. This is a project in Irvine in Scotland where they take garbage and they turn it into electricity, and they do it in a very clean and environmentally friendly way. Now, why don't we do that? Well, there are 2 reasons. The first one is because of permitting. Okay, this is a thermal process. Oh God, everyone's like, thermal, he's going to burn garbage, all right? And that's why we don't do it, because we allow opinions and non-scientific understanding, and we don't let facts get involved in this. People hear thermal processing garbage, and they say they're going to burn garbage, don't let them do it. But in fact, this is a safe process to do this, and we should be doing it. If we took that 1 million tons of garbage that we just dump up in Miramar, bury it in a hole in the ground every year, and turned it into electricity, we could produce enough renewable energy, sort of renewable because it's garbage we're burning, but we could produce enough energy to power 200,000 homes. How many homes are there in San Diego? I mean, there's 1.3 million people in the population. Let's say there's 3 people in a household, right? You're talking about almost half the households in San Diego could be powered just by the garbage that we're throwing away, all right? That's a great opportunity. Here's another interesting thing about garbage. 50% of the weight in a garbage truck, it's water, okay? We're paying to truck water that's so incredibly valuable to us to the landfill. All right, and then we put it in the landfill, the water leaches through the garbage. Guess where it goes, folks? It goes into the groundwater. All right, again, Miramar does a great job of it, but the EPA concedes that every single landfill in the United States is leaching toxic water into the groundwater. If we gasified that garbage, if we turned it into electricity, we could recapture all that water in the condensate, and we could use it for things like irrigation. All right? But we don't do it. And the reason that we don't do it, again, is because, as is all too often the case, I'm afraid, we allow people's opinions, not scientific facts, not knowledge, not technology, but just opinions to get in the way of these things. And so we don't have the sort of the guts to go forward with it. So the usual arguments are, well, we don't have the money. Yes, we do. We waste $190 billion a year on power cuts, okay? We spend $50 billion a year defending the Straits of Hormuz so that we can maintain stable oil prices. Between 75 and $260 billion a year of tax incentives and other federal money for the carbon-based fuels. Okay, so when you hear people saying, oh, the green stuff, it can only work because it's getting federal assistance. Well, utter nonsense. Between 2000 and 2008, green initiatives in this country received $29 billion of federal money. That's a lot of money, you'll see. Okay, but compare that to the $260 billion a year that the oil companies and the coal companies get. Okay, it doesn't even compute. So what we need is that Kennedy moment. We need to say, stop. America, we've done great things in the past. We stormed up the beaches in Normandy. We landed on the moon. We built jet engines and railways and all sorts of other stuff like that. We can do this, and we could do it in 10 years. And we could start right here in San Diego. It's the right place for it to start, frankly. That would maintain the competitive nature of the city. It would clean the place up. And it would mean that we all had something that we could be fantastically proud of. We can be the greatest generation. Our children can grow up in a place that's better, Molly. And it just takes the will, because as I said, we have the money. We have the technology. The question I'm going to leave you here with this afternoon is, do you have the will? Thank you.